The first thing you need to know about the orphanage is the smell. It wasn't the kind of place that smelled bad. Not exactly. It was more like the smell of things left too long in the sun, mixed with musty blankets and old wood. A smell you couldn't escape, one that clung to your clothes and slipped into your skin. Every time I opened my violin case, I could smell it. And every time I did, I thought about the house. I can still see it sometimes in my dreams, not in perfect detail, just flashes of it. There was sunlight pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows, bouncing off glossy wooden floors. The walls were painted a soft cream, and there was a grand piano near the corner. White, pure white, like it had never been touched. I think there was a woman playing it too, her fingers dancing gracefully over the keys. I used to try to picture her face, but it was always blurred, like someone had smudged it out of my memory. I told the caregivers about it once, when I first got to the orphanage. I was just a kid back then, still clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, someone would come for me and Eva. We didn't belong here. I knew it in my bones. That's just your imagination, Luca, one of the caregivers, Mrs. Donnelly, said with a soft chuckle, patting my shoulder like I was a delusional child. Kids like you don't come from places like that. Her words hit me like a slap. Kids like me. She meant orphans. Nobodies. Kids who'd been left behind. But I wasn't like them. I wasn't supposed to be here. Neither was Eva. I don't remember much about how we arrived. They say we were found wandering in some small town, dirty and bruised. Me clutching my violin case like it was the last thing tying me to this world. I didn't speak for days after we got to the orphanage. I just sat by the window, waiting for someone who never came. Eva barely spoke either. She clung to me like a shadow, wide-eyed and silent, watching the other kids but never playing with them. I think she was afraid if she let go of me, she'd disappear. I couldn't blame her. Some nights, I felt like I might vanish too, swallowed up by the walls of this place that always seemed to whisper you're forgotten. But the violin, that was different. That was mine. I don't know where I learned to play it. Sometimes it felt like I had been born with the music already in my fingers. When I picked up the bow, everything else faded away. The teasing, the rough shoves for the older boys, even the smell of the orphanage. All of it dissolved, leaving just me and the music. Late at night, when the other kids were asleep, I'd sneak out of bed and open the case. The violin gleamed faintly in the moonlight that crept through the grimy window. I'd lift it to my chin and play. Soft, slow melodies at first, so I wouldn't wake anyone. Then, as I got lost in it, the music would swell, and I'd feel it wrap around me like a warm blanket. It made me feel safe, like there was still a part of me that belonged to that house in my dreams, even if no one believed it was real. Eva would sometimes sit up and listen, her little face peeking out from beneath her blanket. She never said anything while I played, but I could see the way her shoulders relaxed and how her eyes would start to close. The music comforted her too. In those moments, it was just the two of us, like it used to be. I clung to the violin because it was the only thing from that other life. The caregivers didn't understand it. They thought it was odd that a 6-year-old could play so well. Some even said it was unnatural, as if the violin itself was some kind of curse. I could see it in their eyes when they heard me play, the way their hands would tremble just slightly when they wiped away tears they didn't even realize had fallen. They were touched, but they were also scared. But the other kids, they were a different story. The more I played, the more they resented me. I could feel their eyes on me, whispering behind my back. I was the weird kid with the violin, the boy who thought he came from a mansion, and they hated me for it. There was one boy in particular, Henry. He was a few years older, bigger, and always found a way to make my life miserable. It started small, a push in the hallway, a cruel joke at lunch. But over time, he got bolder. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" He sneered one afternoon as I sat by myself in the corner of the common room. "Think you're special because you can play that thing?" I didn't answer him. I kept my head down, pretending not to hear. That only made him angrier. "I'm talking to you, Luca," he shouted, grabbing the collar of my shirt and shoving me hard against the wall. That's when he made his mistake. He reached for my violin, His fingers grazed the case, and something inside me snapped. It wasn't just anger. It was like a dam had burst, and all the fear, the loneliness, the desperation to hold on to the one thing that mattered to me came flooding out in a torrent of rage. Dionit tioguchich it, I screamed, my voice echoing through the room. Before I knew it, I was hurling a chair across the room. It crashed into the wall with a deafening thud. The other kids froze, wide-eyed and silent. I could see Henry's face drain of color as he took a step back, suddenly unsure of himself. The staff came running, and for the first time, they saw me, not the quiet, calm boy they thought they knew, but someone on the edge of breaking. I could see the confusion in their eyes as they tried to calm me down, but nothing worked. "Give me back my violin!" I yelled, my voice hoarse and trembling. That's when they realized. Laura, the only caregiver who ever really listened to me, put her hand on my shoulder. "It's okay, Luca," she said gently. "We'll get it back." And they did. They made Henry return it. And after that, no one ever touched it again. But something had changed that day. I had lost control. And the worst part was I wasn't sure I could get it back. After the incident, I sat alone by the window, clutching the violin in my lap, Eva's small hand resting on my arm. "It's going to be okay," I whispered to her, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "One day, we'll leave here. I'll take care of you, I promise." But even as I said the words, a part of me still waited for the impossible, for our real parents to walk through those orphanage doors and take us home, even if I didn't know where home was anymore. There was a power in that violin, a power I didn't understand, but one I could feel every time my fingers brushed the strings. I wasn't a kid who played just for fun. No, when I played, it was like everything that had been stripped from me. The memories, the home I couldn't quite remember, was woven back into place. Each note was a thread pulling me toward something lost, something forgotten, but always just out of reach. I didn't know where I learned to play. I couldn't remember anyone teaching me, couldn't recall any lessons or a voice guiding my hand. But the music lived inside me, and every time I played, I was transported. It was the only thing that made sense in a world that had otherwise abandoned me and my sister. The violin wasn't anything special, not to anyone else. It was a simple black case, a modest instrument with scratches along its surface, nothing that would catch your eye. But to me, it was sacred. It held the remnants of a past life, a life before the orphanage, before everything became so gray. Some nights, when the orphanage was quiet, I'd sneak out to the courtyard and sit under the dim streetlight that flickered on the side of the building. The night air was cool against my skin, but as soon as I lifted the violin to my chin, I'd lose track of the cold. I'd lose track of time altogether. The bow would glide across the strings, and the world around me would disappear. It was just me and the music, and in those moments, I felt like I belonged to something again. But that connection came at a price. Henry was the first to notice how much the violin meant to me. He watched me from the shadows of the courtyard one night, his eyes gleaming with something dark and cruel. Henry was the type of kid who thrived on other people's pain, the kind who would step on your fingers just to see you wince. And once he realized that the violin was more than just a toy to me, he saw an opportunity. At first, it was small things. He'd sneak into my room while I was at breakfast and move the case, placing it on a different bed or tucking it beneath the dusty wardrobe. He'd laugh when I'd rush in, my heart pounding, only to find it there, safe but displaced. "Can't even go a day without your little toy, huh, Luca?" He'd snicker, leaning against the doorframe with that smug grin that made my blood boil. But that wasn't enough for him. It never was. Henry wanted to break me. One rainy afternoon, I came back from the common room to find my bed empty. The violin was gone. My heart stopped. I ripped the thin blankets off the mattress, threw the pillows across the room, searched every inch of that tiny space, but it wasn't there. Panic clawed at my chest. I burst into the hallway, my fists clenched, and it wasn't long before I found him. Henry stood in the middle of the common room with a group of the older boys, and in his hand, my violin. He held it up, taunting me with that same cruel grin. "Looking for this?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Something inside me snapped. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, crawling up my neck. "Give it back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor in it. "Why should I? It's just a stupid piece of wood," he sneered, lifting the violin higher, threatening to toss it. My breath caught in my throat. "Don't," I warned, stepping closer, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. "You don't know what you're doing." Henry's eyes gleamed with malice. He knew exactly what he was doing. "It's not like you even know how to play," he said, his voice loud enough for the others to hear. "Maybe it's just time we see what this piece of junk is really worth." I lunged at him, my fingers grabbing the collar of his shirt, but the other boys were on me in seconds. They pinned me down, holding me back as Henry grinned down at me with that twisted satisfaction. And then, before I could stop him, he swung the violin in a wide arc, as if he were about to smash it against the wall. "No!" I screamed, thrashing against the boys who held me down, but it was no use. I watched in horror as the violin flew through the air, hurtling toward the ground. It seemed to hang there, suspended for a moment, as if even the universe couldn't believe what was about to happen. But it didn't shatter. Instead, Laura burst through the doorway, her eyes wide with fury. "Henry," she yelled, rushing toward him. "What do you think you're doing?" He froze, the violin slipping from his grasp, and I scrambled to my feet, rushing forward to catch it before it hit the ground. My hands wrapped around the case just in time, and I held it to my chest, breathing hard, my entire body shaking. Laura stood in front of Henry, her hands on her hips, her gaze like daggers. "You could have broken it," she hissed. "Do you understand what this means to him?" Henry shrugged, his sneer faltering slightly. "It's just a violin," he muttered, but I could see the fear creeping into his eyes now that Laura was there. "He's always showing off with it." Laura stepped closer, lowering her voice. "It's not just a violin," she said, her voice icy. "And if I catch you anywhere near it again, I swear you'll regret it." Henry backed down, his shoulders slumping as he slinked away, the other boys following him like cowards. But even as they left, I could still feel the rage boiling in my chest. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in bed with the violin cradled in my arms, watching the door, waiting for the next time Henry would come for it. Because he would. I knew he would. Boys like Henry didn't stop until they got what they wanted. He wanted to see me broken, and the violin was the key to doing that. I glanced over at Eva, who was curled up in her bed, her little hand clutching her stuffed rabbit. She looked so peaceful, so untouched by the world's cruelty. But I knew that peace wouldn't last. Not if I couldn't protect her. That was the night I made a promise to myself. A promise I whispered into the darkness, one that I hoped would give me the strength I needed. I would protect Eva no matter what. And one day I would get us out of here. I didn't care how long it took. I would find a way. But deep down, beneath all that determination, there was still a part of me that longed for something I couldn't admit out loud. I wanted someone to come for us. I wanted to believe, just for a moment, that the memories I clung to weren't just dreams, that the house with the grand piano was real, that our parents were still out there, searching for us. And until that day came, if it ever came, I would hold on to the violin, because it was the only piece of that other life I had left, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me, not ever again. I knew something was wrong with Eva the moment I saw her eyes. There was a dullness in them that wasn't there before, a hollowness that scared me. She was always pale, but now her skin looked almost translucent, like she could slip away if I didn't hold her tight enough. It started small, just a cough. We were used to kids getting sick at the orphanage. A cold here, a fever there, nothing out of the ordinary. But this was different. I could feel it deep in my bones, like a dark cloud had settled over us, and it wasn't going to lift on its own. At first, the caregivers brushed it off. "She just needs rest. Luca," they told me when I tried to get their attention. "Don't be dramatic." But I wasn't being dramatic. I knew my sister better than anyone, and I knew this wasn't just some harmless cold. Days passed, and her cough worsened. She was burning up 1 minute, shivering the next. The blankets barely stayed on her as she thrashed in her sleep, mumbling words I couldn't understand. Every time I held her hand, it felt smaller and colder, like life was slipping away with each passing breath. My mind raced. I couldn't lose her. Not Eva. Not my sister, the one person in this world I had to protect. The caregivers finally noticed when she stopped eating. They put her in the sick room, away from the other kids, as if isolation could magically cure her. They gave her warm drinks, herbal teas that smelled like weeds, and told me not to worry. But that's all I did. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the sound of her shallow breaths from across the room. And then one evening, Laura pulled me aside. Her face was pale, her usual calm demeanor fractured. "Luca," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "Eva's not getting better. We need to call a doctor." I felt a knot twist in my stomach. I had been telling them this for days, but hearing Laura say it out loud made it real. A doctor meant medicine. Medicine meant money. And money was something no one at the orphanage had. When the doctor came, he was all brisk movements and clinical detachment. He barely glanced at me before examining Eva, his fingers cold and mechanical as he felt her forehead and listened to her labored breathing. His diagnosis came quickly, like a punch to the gut. "Pneumonia," he said, packing away his tools. "Advanced case. She needs treatment, proper medicine. But it won't be cheap." I stared at him, my mind racing. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The doctor looked at Laura, who shook her head slightly, signaling him not to tell me. But I already knew. It didn't matter how much. It was more than we had. Eva needed treatment, and she wasn't going to get it. Not unless I did something. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat by Eva's side. Her face was pale, her lips cracked and dry. She muttered things in her sleep, delirious from the fever. I felt so helpless, so small. I needed to help her, but I had no idea how. I stared at the violin case in the corner of the room, the one thing that had always brought me comfort, and for the first time, I felt nothing but frustration. What good was the violin if it couldn't save Eva? I could play until my fingers bled, but it wouldn't bring a doctor. It wouldn't buy medicine. But then, an idea sparked in the back of my mind, small at first, like a flicker of light. I stared at the violin again, and this time something shifted. What if I played for money? I had seen street performers at the train station before, their hats or cases filled with loose change and bills. It wasn't much, but it was something. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all I had. The next morning, I ran to Laura. "I need to play," I blurted out, before I even had a chance to think it through. At the station. "I can play for money." She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Luca, that's," she started, but I cut her off. "Please. I can't just sit here and do nothing. I have to try. I'll play at the station, and people will give money." "They will. I know it." My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. I had to make her understand. "Please, Laura, let me do this." She stared at me for a long time, her eyes softening with something I couldn't quite place. Sympathy, maybe, or pity. "And what if no one gives you anything?" she asked quietly. "I'll still have tried," I said, my jaw set. I can't live with myself if I don't try. After what felt like forever, she finally nodded. "All right," she said, her voice heavy. "But I'll go with you. If anything happens, I'm responsible for you." We left the orphanage early the next morning. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the empty streets. I wore my best clothes, which wasn't saying much, just an old white shirt and black pants that were too short at the ankles. The violin case felt heavier in my hands than usual, as if it carried the weight of my desperation. The train station was already bustling with people when we arrived. Men in suits hurrying to work, women clutching shopping bags, children tugging at their mothers' skirts. I felt small among them, like a speck of dust in a world that didn't care whether I existed or not. Laura gave me a reassuring nod, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. "You ready?" she asked. adjusting her hat. I swallowed hard and nodded. My hands trembled as I opened the violin case, the sound of the latch clicking echoing louder than I expected. I pulled the violin out, feeling the familiar weight of it in my hands. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't just about playing. This was about saving Eva. I took a deep breath and lifted the violin to my chin. The bow hovered over the strings for a moment, and then I began to play. The music flowed for me like it always did, but this time it was laced with something deeper, something raw and urgent. It wasn't just music. It was a plea, a cry for help, though I would never say the words out loud. The melodies twisted through the air, rising above the clatter of the station, and slowly people began to stop. At first, just a few, a couple holding hands, an elderly woman with a cane. They paused, listening, their eyes softening as the music wrapped around them. Laura moved through the small crowd, holding her hat out, collecting coins and crumpled bills. The hat wasn't filling fast, but it was something. I lost myself in the music. My fingers moved on their own, as if they had a will of their own, carrying me from one piece to the next. And then, just as I was finishing a particularly mournful melody, I felt it, a presence, someone watching me. I glanced up and froze. A man stood near the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on me. He was tall, with dark hair streaked with gray, and a sharp, angular face. There was something about him that sent a chill down my spine, something familiar but unsettling. His gaze never wavered, not even when I faltered for a moment. I quickly looked away, focusing on the violin again, but my heart raced. I didn't know why, but something about this man felt important, dangerous even. I kept playing, my hands trembling slightly, until finally I couldn't stand it anymore. I stopped mid-melody and lowered the violin. The man took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice low and intense. I blinked, taken aback by the question. I don't remember," I stammered, the words tumbling out before I could think. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something else. But Laura appeared at my side, her face tight with concern. "Excuse me," she said firmly, stepping between us. "We need to go." The man didn't move. He just stared at me for another long, unsettling moment before finally turning away. I watched him leave, my heart still racing. Who was he? And why did I feel like I knew him? As Laura hurried me away from the station, clutching the hat full of money, I couldn't stop thinking about the man with the gray-streaked hair. Something told me this wasn't the last time I would see him. The man's eyes stayed with me long after he disappeared into the crowd at the train station. There was something unsettling about the way he had watched me. Too intense, too focused, like he knew something about me that I didn't. And that question he asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" It had echoed in my mind over and over again. I didn't have an answer. I never had. The music had always been there, deep inside, waiting for my hands to find it. But the way the stranger had asked made it sound like he knew where the music came from, like he had seen me play before. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Laura didn't talk much on the way back to the orphanage. Her silence said more than words could. She had seen the man too, had felt the way his presence hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. I knew she didn't like him, and I wasn't sure if I did either. The money we had raised that day felt like an afterthought, though it was enough to buy Eva the medicine she needed. As Laura counted the coins and crumpled bills, I sat in my usual spot by the window, the violin case open at my feet. The station seemed a lifetime away now, and yet the memory of that man still made my skin crawl. "Luca," Laura said quietly, placing the hat full of money on the table. "We did it. This should cover everything Eva needs." I nodded but didn't say anything. I should have felt relief, maybe even happiness. I had saved Eva. Well, not yet, but I had bought her time. Yet all I could think about was the man at the station. Who was he? And why did he feel so familiar, like I had seen him somewhere before? Eva started to improve after a few days. The medicine worked, slowly at first, but I could see the color returning to her cheeks, her fever breaking. She still had a long way to go, but I no longer felt that gnawing fear that I might lose her. That should have been enough to set me at ease. But it wasn't. Every night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I found myself replaying the encounter with the stranger in my head. The way his eyes had locked onto me, how he had seemed to see right through me, as if he knew something about my past, something I didn't. And that question, where did you learn to play? It wasn't just curiosity. It was more than that. It was like he had expected me to give him an answer I didn't have. But maybe, just maybe, he knew something about me, about where I came from, about the house in my dreams, the one I could never fully remember. I didn't talk to anyone about it, not even Laura. She was already worried enough, and besides, what could I say? That I had a feeling this man knew something about me? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. A week after the encounter, the orphanage was thrown into chaos. I was playing my violin in the small courtyard behind the orphanage, a place where I could escape the noise and tension inside. Eva had just been moved back to her room with the other girls, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The violin's melody floated through the air, soft and sad, wrapping around me like a familiar embrace. That's when Laura found me. "Luca," she said, breathless, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. "The headmistress wants to see you. Now." I lowered the violin slowly, my fingers still resting on the strings. The headmistress? I couldn't remember the last time I had been called to her office. It wasn't exactly the place kids like me visited unless we were in trouble, and I hadn't done anything wrong. At least I didn't think I had. Why? I asked, my heart starting to pound. The last time I'd been this nervous was when Henry had nearly smashed my violin. "I don't know," Laura admitted, running a hand through her hair. "But it's important. You need to come." I packed the violin back into its case, my hands trembling slightly. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Had something happened to Eva? Had I unknowingly caused trouble at the station? But none of it made sense. The air in the orphanage felt heavier than usual, like everyone was holding their breath. I walked down the narrow hallway toward the headmistress's office, my feet dragging across the old wooden floors. The door loomed at the end of the hall, heavy and dark, its worn brass handle gleaming in the dim light. I could hear whispers as I passed the other kids, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Why's Luca being called to the headmistress?" someone asked. Another kid snickered. "Maybe she wants to hear him play." Their words bounced off me. I didn't care what they thought. I just needed to know what was going on. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The headmistress was sitting behind her large mahogany desk, but she wasn't alone. Seated in the chair across from her was the stranger. My heart stopped. It was him, the man from the train station. He didn't turn when I entered, but I knew he felt me there. His back was straight, his hands resting casually on his lap, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. "Luca," the headmistress said, her voice unusually kind. "Please, have a seat." I hesitated. My legs felt like they might give out, but I forced myself to cross the room and sit in the chair next to the man. I kept my eyes on the headmistress, though every part of me was aware of his presence beside me. "This is Mr. Rivera," she continued, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "He's a respected musician in the city, and he's come here to speak with you." Mr. Rivera. The name didn't ring any bells, but the way she said it, like I was supposed to be impressed, made me uneasy. Why would a musician come to see me? Mr. Rivera finally turned to face me, and when our eyes met, that strange feeling of familiarity washed over me again. His gray-streaked hair and sharp features seemed etched into my memory, but I couldn't place where I had seen him before the station. "Luca," he said, his voice low but smooth, like someone used to being listened to. "I've come to offer you and your sister a new life." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. I stared at him, my mind reeling. "A new life," I repeated, confused. Mr. Rivera leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I want to adopt you and your sister Eva." "Adopt us?" My chest tightened. This man, this stranger, wanted to take us away from the orphanage. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Why? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Why us? Mr. Rivera's eyes softened, but there was something guarded in his expression, like he was choosing his words carefully. I heard you play at the station, he said, leaning back in his chair. There's something special about the way you play, Luca. Something familiar. Familiar. That word again. It hung between us like a secret. You're a talented musician, he continued. But it's more than that. I believe you and I have more in common than you think. I blinked, my mind spinning. More in common? What did he mean? I glanced at the headmistress, but she was just watching us, her face carefully neutral, as if she knew something I didn't. The room felt like it was closing in on me. Mr. Rivera straightened, his expression unreadable. I want to give you and your sister a better life, a chance to leave this place, a chance to grow, to learn, to remember, to remember. The word hit me like a punch in the gut. I didn't know why, but it felt like he was offering more than just an escape from the orphanage. He was offering something I had been chasing for years without even realizing it. He was offering answers. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Rivera's interest in us than just my violin playing. I couldn't help but wonder, what did this man know about me? About my past? And why did he seem so sure that I would say yes? I swallowed hard, my throat dry. And Eva? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You'll take her too. Mr. Rivera's gaze softened, and he nodded. Both of you. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. This was everything I had dreamed of, an escape, a way out. But there was something about the way he looked at me, something I couldn't place, that made me hesitate. There was a mystery here, one I couldn't ignore. But if Mr. Rivera had the answers, then maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to uncover the truth about who I really was. And so, with my heart pounding in my chest, I nodded. When we left the orphanage, the world seemed brighter, as if stepping out of that grim gray building had lifted some invisible weight off my shoulders. But even as I carried my violin case in one hand and held Eva's in the other, something gnawed at me, a whisper of doubt I couldn't shake. Mr. Rivera's sleek black car waited at the curb, its polished surface gleaming under the morning sun like a dark mirror reflecting everything I didn't know about the man who now stood beside me. Eva, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, looked up at me, wide-eyed and nervous. I gave her a small, reassuring nod, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to comfort, her or myself. Mr. Rivera stood by the car, his tall frame casting a long shadow over us. He wore a crisp, tailored suit that screamed money, the kind of money I had only ever seen in the fantasies the other kids at the orphanage dreamed about. His gray-streaked hair was neatly combed, his expression calm, but behind his serious gaze, I could feel something else. He wasn't just adopting us out of charity. No, there was something more, something he wasn't saying, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The engine purred softly as we climbed into the back seat. Mr. Rivera gave the driver a curt nod, and we pulled away from the orphanage, the building slowly fading into the distance. I felt a mix of relief and fear twist in my chest. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, of leaving that place, of starting fresh. But now that it was actually happening, the unknown stretched out before me like a black hole, pulling me in. Eva's small hand clutched mine tightly. She hadn't said much since Mr. Rivera's visit to the orphanage. She barely knew what was going on, her pale face turned toward the window, eyes darting across the unfamiliar streets as the city flew by. I knew she was scared, but I didn't know how to comfort her. How could I? I barely knew what to think myself. Mr. Rivera's house wasn't what I expected. I had pictured something warm, something welcoming. Instead, when the car finally slowed, we pulled up to a tall wrought iron gate that creaked open as we approached. Behind it loomed a mansion of gray stone, cold and imposing, surrounded by thick trees that cast long, twisted shadows across the gravel driveway. Eva's grip on my hand tightened. She leaned toward me and whispered, "I don't like it." I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It'll be fine," I whispered back, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The car stopped, and Mr. Rivera stepped out, his shoes crunching on the gravel. He glanced back at us, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to your new home," he said, his voice smooth but distant. I wanted to ask him why this place felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Why did this man, with all his wealth and status, choose us? Two orphan kids with nothing to offer but a violin and an old stuffed rabbit? As we stepped inside, the air turned colder, almost suffocating. The grand foyer opened into a vast living room, its high ceilings decorated with intricate chandeliers. A wide staircase curved upward, leading to a second floor we hadn't yet seen. But what caught my attention was the grand piano in the corner. It wasn't white like the one in my dreams. It was black, gleaming and cold, but there it was. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it. This place, this strange house with its dark walls and heavy furniture, was connected to me somehow. I could feel it in my bones. "This way," Mr. Rivera said, leading us through the house. His footsteps echoed on the marble floors, and every sound seemed louder than it should be, as if the house itself was listening. He showed us our rooms, mine with a view of the garden, Eva's overlooking the forest beyond. Eva's room was smaller than mine, and I noticed the way her lips tightened when she saw it, but she didn't complain. She never did. The housekeeper, Senora Marta, was already waiting for us in the kitchen, her face stern but kind as she instructed us to unpack our things and settle in. "If you need anything, you come to me," she said, her voice thick with an accent I couldn't place. "Senor Rivera is busy, very busy." Busy with what? I wanted to ask, but I held my tongue. That night, after dinner, I wandered through the house, my footsteps quiet as I explored the maze of hallways and rooms. Everything here felt oversized, as though the house was meant for people much larger than Eva and me. Every corner I turned, every door I opened, brought with it a sense of unease. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I found myself drawn back to the grand piano in the living room. The moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting eerie shadows across the floor. I approached the piano, my fingers hovering above the smooth, polished surface. Something about it tugged at me, an invisible thread, pulling me closer to a memory I couldn't quite grasp. Without thinking, I lifted the lid and pressed a key. The note rang out, clear and haunting, echoing through the empty room. My heart raced as I played another note, and then another, until my hands were moving across the keys in a melody I didn't recognize but somehow knew. "You play the piano too." The voice startled me, and I jumped back, turning to see Mr. Rivera standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching me intently. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made me uneasy. I don't know," I stammered, taking a step back from the piano. I felt like I knew the music. Mr. Rivera's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe, or something deeper. He walked slowly toward me, his footsteps soft on the carpet. "You've played before," he said, more to himself than to me, "even if you don't remember." He stopped in front of the piano, his fingers brushing over the keys, as if lost in thought. Then, without warning, he turned to me and asked, "Do you ever remember your parents, Luca?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My parents. The ones I had tried so hard to forget, or maybe the ones I had tried so hard to remember. I shook my head, my mouth dry. "No, I don't." Mr. Rivera studied me for a moment, then nodded as if he had expected that answer. "You will, in time," he said, his voice low and cryptic. "There's more to your past than you realize. Your music, your gift, comes from them." From them, my parents. I wanted to ask him what he knew, what he meant, but the words stuck in my throat. Before I could say anything, he turned away, his back to me. "You and Eva, you were brought here for a reason," he continued, his voice steady but laced with something darker. "I'll help you unlock the truth, Luca. But it won't be easy. The past is never easy." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. There it was, the thing I had been waiting for, the admission that this wasn't just about kindness or generosity. Mr. Rivera wanted something from us from me, and he knew more about our past than he was letting on. But as much as I wanted to run, to grab Eva and flee from this mansion with its dark secrets, Something inside me held me back. The pull of the unknown, the promise of answers, of finally understanding who we were and where we came from, was too strong to resist. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. I want to know the truth. Mr. Rivera smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just closed a deal. "Good," he said softly. "Then we'll begin." That night, as I lay in my new bed, the mansion silent around me, I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Rivera's words. The way he had spoken about my parents, about my music, like he knew something I didn't, like he had been waiting for me. And then there was the piano. The music I had played, the melody that had come so naturally, felt like a piece of a puzzle I had forgotten how to solve. As I drifted off to sleep, a thought crept into my mind, one that chilled me to the core. What if Mr. Rivera knew more than just my past? What if he was the key to unlocking something darker, something that had been hidden from me for a reason? I closed my eyes, Eva's soft breathing from the room next door, the only thing anchoring me to the present. Whatever the truth was, I was about to dive into it headfirst. And there was no turning back now.